Hi, this is Matt McCormick at the Department of Philosophy, California State University, Sacramento. This is my second lecture for my Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence course on Robert Sparrow's article, Robots, Rape, and Representation. So here's where we were last time when we stopped. Overall, here's the way Sparrow presents his thesis. He's arguing that the design of realistic female robots that could explicitly refuse consent to sex in order to facilitate rape fantasies would be unethical. Okay, so designing and building rape robots is unethical because sex with robots in these circumstances is a representation of the rape of a woman, and that may increase the rate of rape itself against real women. It expresses disrespect for women, and it demonstrates a significant character defect. And we've just looked at arguments for 1 and 2, I believe. We're going to talk some more about representation in this lecture, but we did consider the argument about 2, about whether or not it increases the rate of rape. And Sparrow finds that those considerations to be compelling. He thinks it's probably true that something like this or like pornography does increase the rate of rape, but he admits that that the evidence is not really clear, the empirical evidence is not really compelling, and that lots of people won't agree. So he just sort of states his support for that idea, and 2, acknowledges that many people disagree, and then moves on. So we're going to, and I've listed this wrong. In this lecture, we're going to talk some more about 1, about representation, because he circles back to that, and then we're going to talk about 3 and 4 to sort of wrap out his argument. Okay, so in what regard or how would designing rape robots and then engaging in something like that be disrespectful? How is it wrong? Not just for the harm it causes, but because of what it expresses or represents. And I think we all have an intuitive sense for how it does this. You look at it, you think about it, you imagine somebody doing something like this. We can imagine some comparable cases. It's hard to see how it wouldn't, but he's going to work out the philosophical details here. So one way to put that is, and this is his attempt to kind of formalize it, if the rape of a robot represents and simulates the rape of a real woman, then performing the first act implicates, is the verb here, the agent in a relationship with the second. So the person who does the first is somehow implicated, connected, tied to the agent in a relationship with the second act. So it's not that the person who rapes the robot actually rapes a woman necessarily, but that their action, their behavior, their simulation, it implicates them in those cases when they happen out in the real world. Robot rape represents and simulates the rape of real women. Therefore, robot rape implicates the robot raper in the real rape of women. The question, of course, is what does the implicate mean here? Because if we're not careful about the way we describe implicate, this is going to have this huge overspill implication, right? That if anytime we do a particular kind of representation of some sort of morally abhorrent act, if that implicates you in the real acts in the real world, then it's going to turn out, if we don't define this right, or if he can't sort of compellingly argue for a special consideration here, that the implication of this argument is going to be that applies to all sorts of things, right? Because we're engaged in simulated murder and simulated theft and simulated abuse and simulated torture. Our entertainment activities, our video games, our movies, our books, our fantasies are all representing and simulating in some ways these real acts, these real morally abhorrent acts. And I don't think that Sparrow wants to get the result that in every one of those cases where somebody's got certain thoughts or somebody's playing a video game, they're now therefore implicated in the real crimes that happen in the world of a similar sort. Okay, so Sparrow says he's sympathetic with this argument, although he acknowledges that many people are going to reject it. And he says that what's going on here is complicity, that by doing this, you're complicit in the actual acts, as a way to describe it. You're exhorting it. So some of this language, you've seen this in lots of the feminist literature about pornography, that by producing, by designing, by generating certain kinds of images or certain kinds of simulations, you're complicit and you're exhorting it. It's like you're recommending it in some sense. Now, there's got to be different senses of recommend here, because the person who's engaged in raping a robot may not necessarily be explicitly, directly exhorting someone else to go do likewise, but there's a sense in which that person is acknowledging it. They're saying yes to it. They are affirming the action, and there's something about that affirmation that's morally problematic. And I don't have a beef here with Sparrow on this issue. I think that's right. You're getting connected to it somehow, so that's a serious moral consideration that's got to be sort of figured into the calculus here. And of course, again, it depends on the context and depends on what else is going on, and it's a kind of endorsement of the activity. Again, hard lines to draw here, hard lines to sort of carve out. I mean, I'm thinking of cases, what about the BDSM community, where people are engaged in, willful, voluntary, mutually consenting sex acts that involve sadism or masochism? Is it also true that they're complicit, that they're exhorting or they're endorsing it? You go to the Folsom Street Fair in San Francisco every year in the spring, and there's people, all set up out on the street doing wild S&M, BDSM, sex play. Now, this is with consenting adults who've both been very explicit about their engaging in it, and they both want to do it. But is there a sense in which portraying or representing or simulating, flogging someone or torturing someone is exhorting or endorsing it? Sparrow's got a hard sort of little space to carve out here, I think. There's more to be said about the details here. So his view is, in answer to this question, does representation intrinsically get carried with the object? I think his view here is that it does, and it gets established by the relationship of the simulation, the representation to the community. It depends on how the community sees it, and maybe that's a place where Sparrow can drive a wedge in between, say, my BDSM example or some other, or a violent video game example, that maybe it's what it means to the community is what makes the difference. Because his view is that if we ask what is representing rape, we might have a naive correspondence view. So you might just say something like, well, look, sex with a robot is rape because at least it corresponds or represents it because it looks just like the rape of a person. So it has the same sort of similarity. And I'm going to explain why there's a picture of me and R2-D2 there in a second. So on that naive correspondence view where somebody just says, well, it represents rape because it looks like rape. Well, then Sparrow says, well, then the problem would be that if the robot looks different enough from a human, if it's unhuman enough like in its appearance, then you've severed the representation and it no longer carries that with it. Sparrow then says, look, because meaning is social, the representational content of symbols or actions is determined by reference to the understandings of a relevant community. Because, meaning here, what you're communicating, what you're doing, has more to do and more implication in the world because you're part of a socio-linguistic community where your words mean things, your actions mean things, and people understand those to mean things. So here's my sort of selfish story that's not quite on the point, but close. I was doing an event with... lots of you know that I've got an R2-D2 robot, and I was doing an event, a big event in San Francisco. Lots and lots of people were there. There was a couple of reporters from from a local news station, and one of the reporters, he wanted to interview me, and the other guy was a cameraman. And they pulled me aside and begged and pleaded for me to stop, because I was trying to get out of there, and they wanted to talk and they wanted to interview me for their little news piece to go on camera that night. So I stopped and we talked for a little while, and they filmed me and went on back and forth. And then the cameraman afterwards, he turned off the camera and he said, hey, can I take a picture with your R2-D2? Please, let me take you a picture with your R2-D2. I said, sure, no problem. And I've got my younger son with me there at the time, and I was kind of distracted for a minute, and I look back, and the guy is behind the R2-D2, and he's wildly humping it for his social media posts. He's taking pictures of himself, like grabbing it and humping the R2-D2 from behind. So it's really, he's got his tongue out, and it's like this really kind of gross frat boy stunt. And he's snapping pictures, and got his buddy snapping pictures, and he's going to post it on, Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And I got to say, my feelings were really hurt, and like I really felt offended. Like these guys had asked me for a favor, and they wanted to take a minute to interview me, and then the guy's like asking real nice to let me take pictures with the R2-D2, and I turn around, and the guys are like making these really lewd, gross gestures on the R2-D2, and just acting like an idiot. And I was genuinely hurt and offended. I was offended, and and the reason I'm just telling this story here is that I take Sparrow's point here that kind of behavior, right? That his doing that, it means something. It indicates something, right? It's not like that his actions, him with his tongue out and grabbing the R2-D2 and humping it and all that. It's not like that's just completely in isolation. It has no connection to the real world. Like, we all know what that means, and we all know what that implies, and he's just being I don't know how to understand that, but I definitely understand that that's rude and offensive, and I took offense at it, and I got mad at the guy. I chewed him out, and I made him right there in front of his buddy. I made him delete the pictures off of his phone, and once he had been sort of called out on it, and once I had been really directly blunt about the whole thing, he was so embarrassed and he was humiliated by the whole thing. He felt like a little kid who'd been caught doing something naughty, and you could just see from his face that he realized, oh shit, I've done something really really rude here. I shouldn't have done that. So I say all this to support Sparrow's general point that meanings are not just sort of what the actor or the agent wants them to be. They're not just in your head in isolation. They're socio and linguistic meanings that are embedded in a larger context. And what an action means or what a gesture means depends on how people take it, what they take it to mean. Okay, so what Sparrow says is that what sex with a robot represents then will depend on what other members of the community are inclined to infer when they witness or learn about it. Okay, so now imagine half of the population, women, who find out or observe or know that there's guys who are who've got robots that look just like women, and they act like women who are being raped. They protest, they yell, they say, "Stop, don't rape me," right? How are they going to understand that gesture, that behavior, that action? The meaning of that event is, and Sparrow's got to be right about some of this, is anchored to, what those people take it to mean. So it's not as if the thing can be divorced or separated. Okay, so representation is social. So robot rape is a representation of real rape. What would be the point, after all, of building a robot that's shaped like a woman and that calls out, "No, please don't rape me," if not to refer to real women being raped? It's not as if it's just an accident that they came up with that sort of robot behavior. That robot behavior was put there for a particular reason, to communicate something specific, or to do or to be or to have a certain kind of nature. Meaning social, Sparrow argues, the representational content of symbols or acts is determined by the understandings of the relevant community. People will see this as referring to rape, and surely he's right about that. Okay, so here's a possible objection. Absent the claim that enjoying the representation makes them more likely to rape in reality, it is not clear why it should imply anything at all about their attitude towards real rape. So the objection here is just to say, well, look, but if you can't establish a clear connection between those kinds of representations, or enjoying those kinds of representations, and an actual uptick or increase in the probability of rape in the world, right, unless the representation is connected to real rapes in reality, then it's not clear why the fact that it represents rape should imply anything about their attitude, that is the actor or the designer's attitude, towards real rape. So goes the objection. What I've been arguing is that it's very hard to disentangle those two. And the question here is, well, okay, but where's the empirical evidence that supports the connection, that it actually communicates or it actually levers into real harms, real increased risk and harm? Now, I think what somebody like Sparrow or somebody who's an advocate of an argument like this can say is, look, I don't have to demonstrate a direct causal link between some portrayal X and an actual uptake in rape in the world. We don't have to draw sort of a direct causal line from this event to that event to be able to say, look, they're connected, they mean this, and they are part of a general overall attitude. And one of the things Sparrow talks about here in the last part of the article is rape culture, right? So rape culture is diffuse, but the thing is, there's 1,000 ways in which every day there's little things that contribute to an overall culture that facilitates these sorts of these activities, that facilitates real crime against real women. And even if you can't pin down a direct causal line between any particular cases, the contribution to rape culture overall is objectionable for good reasons. So here we can think about this for a second. So he considers something he calls the magic circle objection. And the magic circle objection, something like, and I don't know what his source for calling it magic circle is, but it strikes me as a million style argument. And the argument is that, look, our thoughts ought to be free. We ought to be able to think what we like inside our minds. What matters is our actions, and what matters is what we do to people. But our thoughts ought to be, that ought to be a privileged place where I can think about, engage in all sorts of different, creative, interesting, stimulating ideas in order to expand or whatever. So it's a mistake, goes the objection, to treat fantasy as if it were reality. And we should preserve the realm of representation for the development and entertaining of the most radical ideas and for the free play of libidinous energies. Okay, so this is Sparrow trying to give a charitable reconstruction of this objection to his own argument. I think that that's a pretty poor statement of the argument. I think that we could make a much better argument for the freedom of thought. And the Mill argument goes that, look, none of us has a privileged or particularly unique or successful access to the truth, and that when we all have a free exchange of ideas and we have the freedom to explore different ideas in our minds and then communicate those and hash out our differences and work out our contrary hypotheses and ideas in the free marketplace of ideas, that's when we're at most liberty, and that's when we achieve the sort of highest as Mill saw it, sort of the highest form of civilization, where we have this free, open exchange of ideas. So there's a long-standing tradition here that goes all the way back to the French Revolution of this idea of a liberal, the liberation of the mind, being able to think whatever we want to think and talk about whatever we want to talk about, and then we work out our differences with each other, and then we maximize our liberties and our freedoms socially through the sort of the political context. So there's a very powerful overall default assumption in favor of free speech and free thought in that regard, going all the way back from Mill. Now, somebody might have a hard time connecting that all the way to rape of robots, but the general view, and this has been the case in the law too, is that we default in favor of free speech, and we only in those most extreme cases do we free speech and free thoughts. Only in those most extreme cases do we allow any sort of legal restriction or implication where we restrict or confine what it is people can say, how they express themselves. So here's Sparrow's answer to this argument. Look, he says, we already condemn racist representations for what they represent. So I've got an old racist cigarette box cover up there in the right-hand corner, and then here's a Nazi march in Virginia last year with with these guys carrying Confederate flags and Nazi flags, and they're carrying those for a reason. They're carrying those because of what they represent, and they're trying to deliberately communicate a particular idea. Now, our endorsing free speech is compatible with our also saying that that is morally offensive and that one ought not to endorse or exhort or promote those kinds of ideas. And the other thing I've got here, I've got some much better ones coming, but here's a really obnoxious old ad that sort of demeans women and their role in the workplace. So look, he says, we already condemn racist representations for what they represent, so there seems to be no good reason not to extend to that to sexist and rape representations. Why can't we object just as heartily to those kinds of representations as we do in those other cases? And, there's a lot more to be said here that sorry for the shock here. There's a lot to absorb on this slide. Sparrow doesn't talk about this, but I will recommend that you go look up an old documentary from probably the 90s by a psychologist probably. Her name is Jean Killbourne, and the documentary is called Killing Us Softly. And Killbourne went through and gathered up images from women's fashion magazines and women's fashion campaigns, and she skimmed out all the ones that were demeaning, that were sexist, that were violent, that portrayed rape, that dehumanized women, and she came up with this sort of shocking list. And what's really sort of disturbing about all this is that the one in the middle is a Burger King ad, the other one's a Dolce & Gabbana ad, and it's pretty clear that there's a gang rape going on here, and it's been highly eroticized and made into this sort of sexy thing with these guys with oiled up muscles, and the woman is protesting, but she's also engaged. And the other picture here is of this guy's got this woman who appears to be dead, and he strangled her on the top of his car. And these are in high fashion magazines, right? There's hundreds of examples of these sorts of pictures in our magazines, on the magazine stand, back when we had magazines, or women being treated as meat or what have you, right? So Killbourne finds all of these cases, and when you put it all together, you sort of take them out of their context and you put them into this, you put them like this, and you realize, oh shit, like that really does contribute to an overall set of attitudes about the dehumanization of women, and that's all part of rape culture. Like there it is. There's what Sparrow is talking about, and when your radar gets sensitive to it and you start looking around, you realize it's everywhere, right? So I think Sparrow here, this helps Sparrow. He can say, look, this is just another example that exhorts. Do these portrayals, do they exhort violence against women? Well, look, there's several pictures that are making violence against women sexy. There's a kind of endorsement there. There's a kind of mixed signals that's giving, right? Because they're making them highly erotic and they're making them dead or victims of violence or whatever. And that seems like it's they're doing it to be provocative and to get your attention, but they're also they're communicating a particular kind of message. And what that means depends on us. It means the reason they're doing that is because we're the community that consumes it, and we see it and we feel that connection and we feel the arousal, plus we feel there's two kinds of arousal here. There's one kind of arousal which is violence, it's victim and attacker, and there's another kind of arousal here that's erotic or that's sexual. And by putting those two together, they're doing something to us. And even though you might not be able to pin a particular rape on that particular ad campaign, it can't be that that's helping. It can't be that that's making us better in the bigger picture. Now, making us better actually gets to the heart of what I think is probably one of Sparrow's best arguments with regard to virtue ethics. Okay, so I'll come to that in just a second. So some questions to think about here. Do these increase the probability that some harm comes to these groups? Like those ads. Do those ads increase the probability that women are the victims of violence? There's been a lot of research on this. I don't want to dive into that big controversy. It's kind of hard to imagine how men and women can be subjected to hundreds or thousands of images like that over the courses of their lives and have it not impact their thinking about violence and their proclivities, their propensities, and their behaviors. Do we conclude on the basis that they're wrong? There's something pretty offensive about those, and we do find some of those portrayals as wrong. How is wrong here different from shouldn't be allowed? So Sparrow's not arguing for banning any of this stuff. All he just wants to say is, look, this is morally objectionable. These are unethical portrayals, and this is an unethical thing to do. Are we within our rights, free rights of speech or free rights of thought to express ourselves, these ideas? So what should we conclude about these kinds of cases? And what about hate speech cases, right? Okay, so a bit more to think about here. Consider the community definition of representation that Sparrow's given. Can we think of other cases where a representation, because of the community-embedded social context of representation, where what the representation means is determined by and identified by the socio-linguistic community and is clearly wrong? Okay, so can we think of another case, not the rape case, but another case? Now, I don't know how you feel about this one, but that cartoon of Muhammad, because there's an explicit condemnation of any sort of portrayals of Muhammad in Islam. That cartoon came out in Charlie Hebdo, which is a French satire magazine. That might also be the one that was in a magazine in Denmark. And since they published that cartoon, and it's clearly not sympathetic, right? It's got Muhammad with a bomb in his turban. So perhaps it's racist. It's promoting this mistaken idea that Muslims are terrorists or what have you, and it's portraying Muhammad. There's a case where they knew what they were doing. They were deliberately trying to provoke and trying to draw attention to this question out of a sort of exercise of free speech. And in the case in Denmark, and then particularly with Charlie Hebdo, the offices of that magazine in France were invaded by a group of Muslim extremists who then shot and killed most of the journalists in the office. So there was this horrible mass shooting by Muslim terrorists who were offended by Charlie Hebdo's making fun of Muhammad, and they went and killed the journalists. I don't know what you make of that kind of case, or whether that's a good example here that helps Sparrow or not. I don't know what you think about that case. And I've given a couple of other examples. Here's another one where a girl, just a young girl, has been portrayed in this highly sexualized manner, and she's been eroticized, and she's just a kid, so there's sort of this pedophilia vibe to the whole thing. So is that a case where we've got a representation, because of it's a community-embedded context, where it expresses something to the community and it's clearly wrong? I'm not bothered by that very much. That conclusion about this pedophile case, but that got approved and got published in Marie Claire, one of these magazines, or Cosmopolitan or something. So blackface costumes are another example that's come up in more recent cases where people think that white people dressing up in blackface for Halloween is deeply offensive, and they find that unethical because of what it communicates, and they condemn that. Sexist violence against women, portrayals of Muhammad, and so on. Okay, so those are some other cases to think about in the context that might help us sort of triangulate on what's wrong about the rape of robots. Okay, so now about virtue. We've been talking about, I promised that we would talk about virtue here. Sparrow argues that our thoughts and desires are relevant to the assessment of our character. So this is going back to sort of a classic line all the way back from Aristotle about analyzing the morality of our lives in terms of, well, what sorts of character traits are you building? What virtues are you developing with your behaviors? Because virtue is something that's acquired over a long time, over lots of practice and lots of behavior, as is vice. So by indulging in vice, by indulging in wrong behaviors, virtue ethical theories don't locate the wrongness in the act so specifically on the harm you did to somebody with your bad act, but the idea is that we ought to be conscious of and trying to promote the long-term development of virtue so that our characters are more prone by habituation to do the right things in situations, and we're less prone to do the vicious or the vice, enact the vicious behaviors in situations. So virtue ethicists ask, what sort of person would do something like that? And what are you doing to yourself by engaging in something like that? To what extent do we possess, and are we cultivating certain virtues or vices with our actions? And Sparrow's point is clearly that, look, if you've got a rape robot and you're engaging in that, you're building the wrong kinds of vices. You're doing harm to your character. Are we kind? Are we brave? Do we have good judgment? Are we wicked people? These questions can only be answered over extended times about our dispositions, our tendencies, our habituations, and our development of virtue, right? So for Aristotle, in some sense, you can't really draw a conclusion about somebody's moral character until the end of their life and how they've lived and made their decisions and what sorts of proclivity they have to do the right things and the tendency to not do the wrong things. So do we feel, and this takes cultivation, do you actually automatically, have you trained yourself to feel the right things in the appropriate situations and think or have a feeling the wrong way itself may be reprehensible considered this way, right? So by engaging in the raping of robots, you're encouraging, you're fortifying, you're entrenching the wrong kinds of feelings in an awful situation, and you're building out your character in a way that's that's bad for you. So raping robots then, argues Sparrow, is bad for our virtue. In virtue ethics, what's wrong with raping robots is that a person enjoys and engages in it over an extended period. And of course, this objection won't work as well against somebody who's just tried it once, I suppose. Taking pleasure in it builds that particular vice. It habituates you to take pleasure in that. And it reveals them to have a vicious disposition. It reveals them to be sexist, intemperate, and cruel, and it reinforces that character trait. And some of you may know I have this other article. Well, let me make this point first. Okay, so the italics bullets here are my side comments. Should these assessments of virtue be tied to some empirical measure, or are we content to allow our conclusion that act X is bad for virtue to follow solely from our intuition that it is? Isn't this an empirical question? Okay, so here's what I'm getting at. I just made this pitch on Sparrow's behalf that it sure seems like we're building vicious character when we engage in activities like that. And, the Aristotelian approach says that you need to make a habit over the long term of your life of making the right choices in the appropriate situations, and then developing this tendency to sort of automatically have virtue, to do the good things. And what I'm worried about is that it might be possible to construct a kind of intuitive justification of that sort for all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, doesn't it actually matter whether that works? Doesn't it matter? Isn't there some empirical way we could confirm that in fact engaging in activity X makes you worse overall? I mean, maybe there's a way to check to see whether high consumption of porn or high consumption of violent video games or high consumption of this or the habituation of this activity does in fact lead to someone's being less likely to have virtue X, Y, and Z and more likely to have vice A, B, and C, right? I want to have some kind of metric on this so that we can prove it. I don't want the Aristotelian or the virtue ethicist to just be pitching these arguments on the basis of their intuition that it's true. And I struggled with the reason I've got my article there, I've listed this article of mine that got some attention about is it wrong to play violent video games, is that in that article I end up struggling with the same question about violent video games. It didn't appear to me, and I didn't conclude in that argument that on Kantian grounds or utilitarian grounds that you could condemn playing violent video games, but I did open the door in that argument to this kind of point. I said that, look, it may be that by engaging in these simulated activities of violence, theft, torture, what have you, in Grand Theft Auto or wherever, that we are building vice, that it's bad for our character. But again, if that is not borne out by the empirical evidence, it's not borne out in the real world in terms of something that shows in people's behavior, then I'm not sure that I'm willing to sign on for the virtue ethical argument against it. I want to know, are these activities actually bad for virtue, and what would constitute a disproof of the claim, right? I don't want this argument to be based just on intuition. It's got to be possible to disprove it. It might turn out that we empirically discover that there isn't a correlation between, high consumption of pornography or high consumption of, women's fashion magazines does actually lead to an increased proclivity to do X, Y, or Z. And if empirically that turned out to be the case, then it would look like, Aristotle's making an empirical sort of claim that seems intuitive, but, our intuitions are often very wrong about these matters. So I want to see, I'm open to the virtue ethical point, but I want to see some metric in the world that measures it and gives some support to it. Okay, now here's a possible problem that Sparrow considers for the virtue ethics objection. Here's an asymmetry. He says, and he offers this right up, I hadn't thought about it until I read it, but he says, look, it's not plausible that sustaining kind and loving relationships with robots can be sufficient to make us virtuous. Patting a robot dog does not itself make us a kind person. So interestingly, Sparrow flips it. And so the argument we just considered is that, the claim is that by engaging in robot rape, you reinforce, and it makes you vicious. It reinforces vice in your character. So somebody might say, okay, then, if I use robots or technology or something to mimic or simulate kind and loving relationships, what if I get a female robot and I'm super kind and loving and respectful and decent to the robot? By your argument, if my raping it leads to the erosion of my moral character, then my behaving virtuously towards it ought to lead to the enhancement and improvement of my moral character, right? Fair is fair. If it works one way, it should work the other way. And Sparrow comes right out and says, no, it doesn't work the other way. These sorts of activities can make you worse, make your character worse, but engaging in kind and loving or virtuous simulated activities with technology or robots, that doesn't make you better. You need to have a principled, sort of reasoned ground for making that distinction. I don't think it's fair to just sort of say, well, it works for the arguments I want it to and not for the others. So he says, taking pleasure in unethical behavior may be unethical. We've been arguing more strongly than that. And it's not clear that pleasure in representations of ethical behavior is itself ethical. So this is a bit softer in his part, but he's saying his suggestion is that bad acts makes us bad, but good simulated represented acts don't necessarily make us good. Sparrow doubts that enjoying fantasizing about good deeds in and of itself makes us good, but he does seem to be arguing that enjoying fantasizing about evil deeds in and of itself does make us worse. Okay, so that's a question or a problem. How do you justify this double standard here? Okay, I'm not going to tackle it. Final section for Sparrow is this. So now let's get back to the designers, because that's ultimately what this is all about. It's about the people who design and build the robots. We've been focusing largely on the people who engage in the raping, but let's talk more specifically, his overall thesis is about designing them. What about the designers? Why do designers have a responsibility for how the products are used? If one held that designers had no responsibility for the uses to which their products were put, then this conclusion might not follow. Right, so Sparrow's acknowledging that if you think that somebody designs and builds some product X and then lets it loose out in the world, and then what happens with it after that is not their problem. It's not their fault, right? So if you think there's a break between the design and production of a product and then the use that becomes of it and then the implications of the use, if you think there's a separation there, then Sparrow's argument's obviously not going to follow. He's not going to be able to criticize the designers. It's not their fault. They didn't do it. They just built the thing, and then people went off and did awful things with it. On the other hand, it is possible that the design of robots for rape might be unethical, even if the rape of robots were not. Because, for instance, the former project expressed morally reprehensible attitudes towards women that the latter did not. So what he's arguing here is that in principle, theoretically, even if you think the actual raping of the robots itself might not be wrong, it might be that the design of them is morally reprehensible because of what it communicates, because of what their attitude towards women it indicates, and so on, right? So designing it, having the awful ideas you had and putting the thing together, that could be unethical in and of itself, independent of what people then go on to do with them. That's their business. Okay, so several questions here. Look, if enjoying raping robots is likely to increase the probability that the user eventually commits an actual rape, then designing them would be unethical, says Sparrow. So he considered that argument. It's inconclusive, but suppose it does increase real rape, then the person who designed that thing is responsible and therefore unethical for increasing real rape. Okay, so I got a question. Is the manufacture of guns, which manifestly does increase the probability of murder then, is that unethical too? Now, maybe Sparrow is totally receptive to that idea. This is a question about, again, the implication of the argument, right? Because Sparrow wants to have a close connection between the design and production of a product and then its use. So it would seem by implication that if it's true that building rape robots increases the probability of actual rape, and then that therefore makes the designer implicated and unethical in what they did, then hey, same goes for guns, right? And there's lots of people out there going to protest that or going to argue there's something wrong. So either you've got to adopt the same view about guns, or you've got to say that the argument doesn't work for either, that the use that the product gets made of the product is not, it doesn't implicate the manufacturer at all. Now, in the U.S., it's interesting that the NRA has very successfully pressured federal Congress people to prevent this from happening, but there have been many families of gun violence victims who have tried to sue in civil cases, sue gun manufacturers. They wanted to go after Smith & Wesson or go after the manufacturers of the guns that killed their kids at Sandy Hook or what have you. And the reason that those cases haven't gone through in many instances is because the NRA lobby has spent so much money pressuring and leveraging American congressmen that they've made it illegal or otherwise legally prevented civil suits of that sort from going through. But as I understand it, recently some of those were allowed to go through in an appeals court. So American culture, NRA and so on, gun culture is sort of, in the midst of struggling over this question. I think in lots of other countries, this is just not an issue. They would happily accept the point of my italicized question here, and so would Sparrow. Sparrow is in Australia, if he may be Australian as well, I can't recall. Even if one thinks that engineers are not responsible for the decisions of users to use their products, they are under an obligation not to design a product that imposes an elevated risk of rape on 50% of society when used for its intended purpose. That's a pretty powerful point if it's true that it does increase the risk of rape. I mean, you're putting a product out there in the world that will cause an uptick in the rape of 50% of the population. So it sounds on its surface like a pretty plausible connection between the outcomes of those actions and what you designed or what you did. But maybe this is problematic depending on what you want to say about guns, about cigarettes, about motorcycles, about all sorts of things, right? That might have similar implications there. Maybe we're happy with those implications. Maybe Sparrow is, but some Americans are gonna cry foul about that point. Okay. Designing is also sexist and morally repugnant, Sparrow argues. Robots designed for the purpose of rape would represent a moral hazard to the character of the user. It's a little bit like building slot machines, that you're creating a trap, a moral hazard. You're creating a thing that will exploit weaknesses in human character, and it'll do harm to them as a result. You're making a thing it's a moral hazard. My kids had a trampoline. Then in the previous house we lived in, we had it in the backyard, so it's behind a fence. But in the new house, we only had room for it in the front yard. So I put it in the front lawn. There's no fence. It's just out there. And I didn't care. I just let the neighborhood kids jump on it. But one of my friends, a lawyer, said that I had created an attractive nuisance. So it's not a moral hazard, but I had created a hazard that sucked those kids in, that drew them in, and it did. And I looked out there, and there's 25 of them jumping on it one day, right? I created a situation that the way they couldn't help themselves, and then they jump on the thing and they get hurt. And that's on me. Like I've done wrong by creating that hazard. So building or designing a rape robot, you're creating a moral hazard for people out in the world by similar implication, and we're going to have the cops give you a ticket. If users rape these robots, it may elevate the rate of rape in the community, will express sexist and derogatory attitudes towards women, and will negatively impact the character of the user. So the three ways that they might be wrong is that they're causing rape, they're representing rape, they're eroding character. So Sparrow does not have good things to say about the designers here. Designing and building the rape robots puts people at risk. Another problem, just a side note, I'll get through this quickly. What if they design the sex robots to always consent? Okay, so instead of building it so that it protests and fights and says, no, don't rape me, what if they just make it so it always goes along, so it's always happy to have sex with you? Sparrow says that's problematic too. All sex with such a robot would represent consensual sex, but now the robot itself would represent a woman who never refused sex. So that's problematic, says Sparrow, because the idea that women are always available for sex and that they always say yes is a central tenet of rape culture. That's one of the problems, right? Is that the idea is that they're supposed to always be available to satisfy, men's needs, and that they've got no say in the matter, no protest. The design would therefore express sexist and disrespectful attitudes towards women, and is therefore unethical. If you built it that way, you're building an unrealistic woman that represents something really awful. It represents, a lack of autonomy. Maybe it'd be like. Maybe here's a comparable case. Suppose somebody builds some racist robot manufacturer builds an African-American robot and then embeds it with all of the worst stereotypical behavior of racist attitudes towards African-Americans. So they make it behave in all the ways in which racists typically stereotype African Americans. There's something repugnant, morally repugnant about doing that, about making it represent that and be that sort of African American. Maybe, I wonder what Sparrow would think about that kind of case. So it looks like until they can build it to refuse consent, and it's not okay to design them, or I'm not sure how to take all this from Sparrow. I think maybe he says we should just steer around this thing altogether. We should avoid this. I mean, if we want to stay away from the moral implications of it, that we shouldn't be designing anything like this. Okay, so in conclusion, the meaning of our relationships with robots is connected to the community of the affected and relevant parties. A sex act with a robot is the rape of the robot when it represents the rape of a woman. Raping a robot is morally problematic for the character of the user. Therefore, the design of such robots is morally problematic.